He thought the cabin would be exactly the way he left it, cold, quiet, and empty enough that his footsteps would echo. Instead, he opened the door and heard something breathing in the dark. Not just one thing, 3. And when the shape stepped into the firelight, he realized his mountain wasn't nearly as empty as he'd always believed. The wild had moved in and claimed his home, and it brought its children. Caleb Reed had never liked coming down from the high country. The valley felt too crowded, too loud, and too full of people who remembered his parents better than they remembered him. But even mountain boys needed flour and salt, and enough money to keep a roof from falling in. So for 3 long weeks he'd swung an axe for a logging crew below the tree line, sleeping in a bunkhouse that smelled like wet wool and diesel, counting the nights until he could go back up to where the air tasted like pine and stone. He started the climb home before dawn, pack heavy on his shoulders, boots biting into a trail still slick with old snow. The mountain greeted him the way it always did, quiet at first, then slowly waking as the sun pulled color out of the ridges. Jays argued over nothing. A squirrel scolded him as if he were the intruder here, not the other way around. Somewhere far off, a raven's call echoed against rock. It should have felt like coming home. It almost did. Almost. There was a knot in his chest he couldn't quite shake, a feeling that had followed him since the bunkhouse, like he'd left something unfinished, like the world had shifted a little while he wasn't watching. Grief did that sometimes. His parents had been gone for 2 winters now, taken by a fever that worked faster than any storm. Some days the loss felt like background noise, a dull ache. Other days it hit sharp, unexpected, like stepping on a hidden root under the snow. Today, climbing toward the cabin, it felt like both. By mid-afternoon, the familiar notch in the ridge came into view, the one that cradled the clearing his father had carved from the trees with stubborn hands. Caleb paused at the last bend, breath steaming, and watched the thin line of his chimney. No smoke curled from it. Good. No one had been messing around where they didn't belong. He shifted his pack and started into the clearing, and stopped dead 2 steps in. Something was wrong. At first, he couldn't name it. The cabin looked the same. Rough-hewn logs, small porch, the nailed-up horseshoe his mother swore was the reason lightning always hit the far ridge instead. But the snow between the trees told another story. A wide track circled the cabin, pressed deep and heavy, like logs had been dragged along the ground. Near the woodpile, something like a heel print, if a heel were twice the size of his hand and sank a good inch deeper than his own boot. Caleb's heart stumbled. Black bear, he thought automatically, but the idea didn't quite fit. Bear tracks were more rounded, claws showing in neat arcs. These prints were longer, almost human in shape but wider, with toes like blunt clubs. He'd seen something like them before, high on a wet slope where he'd told himself the mud had distorted a regular footprint. He'd walked faster that day, listening too hard to the trees. Every story he'd ever laughed off as superstition rose now like mist at the back of his mind. Bigfoot, Ridgewalker, Old Man of the Timber. His father used to smile when people whispered over coffee, but he never mocked them. Mountains keep their own secrets, he'd say. We're just visitors, even if we're born here. Caleb swallowed, forcing his legs to move. Tracks or no tracks, the cabin was his. Whatever had been sniffing around was gone now. Probably. He stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked the way they always had, complaining under his weight. That small, familiar sound steadied him. He reached for the latch, expecting the usual resistance of a swollen winter door. It opened too easily. The hairs along his arms lifted. His father always locked the door, even if they'd just gone to check a snare. "You don't invite trouble," he'd say. Caleb had locked it himself before leaving for the valley. He was sure of it. He pushed the door gently with 2 fingers, letting it swing inward. The air that rolled out was wrong. Not the still, dusty chill of a closed cabin, but warmer, layered with scents that didn't belong. Wet fur, damp earth, something musky and wild under the faint smoke of an old fire. He stepped inside and stopped just over the threshold, letting his eyes adjust. Light slanted in through the single window, catching motes of dust and other things. The table had been moved a few inches off its mark, legs scraping faint grooves in the floorboards. His father's old rocker, the one that faced the stove, sat slightly crooked, as if someone too large had tried to sit in it and given up. The curtain at the back, the one that hid his sleeping alcove, hung crooked on its rod. And on the floor, beside the cold stove, lay a bone. Deer, by the look of it. Stripped clean, but not the way a knife would do it. The edges were crushed, teeth marks deep as thumbprints. Caleb's fingers tightened on the strap of his pack. He listened. The cabin had always had a sound to it, a soft creak, a ticking as the stove cooled, the sigh of wind at the single-pane window. Now there was something else underneath, so faint he almost missed it. A low, steady huff of breath, then another, not the even rhythm of someone sleeping in a bed, but heavier, more primal, coming from behind the curtain. For one stretched-out moment, he considered backing out, closing the door, and walking down to the ranger station to let men with badges and guns handle it. But he knew how that story went. Anything they found behind that curtain would not be given the benefit of the doubt. It would be a threat, automatically, no matter how it looked at them. "The mountain's cruel enough without our help," his father's voice murmured from memory. Caleb set his pack quietly by the door. His pulse thudded in his ears. "All right," he whispered under his breath, as much to himself as to whatever waited beyond the hanging cloth. "My house." His fingers closed on the edge of the curtain. He pulled it aside in one motion, before fear could stiffen his arms. They were bigger than he expected. Even curled on his narrow bed platform, the creature's shoulders nearly spanned the width of it. Thick fur, dark and shaggy, glistened with melted snow near the tips. One massive hand, if it could be called a hand, rested on his extra blanket, fingers curled loosely, knuckles the size of small rocks. Its chest rose and fell in deep, slow breaths. A Bigfoot. An actual, living Bigfoot. For a heartbeat, his mind refused to make sense of the sight. It was as if every campfire story he'd ever heard had stepped out of the smoke and laid down on his mattress. But before panic could throw him backward, something else moved. 2 smaller shapes huddled against the great chest. He hadn't noticed them at first, half hidden in the fur. One lifted its head now, blinking at him with eyes too large for its face. A juvenile, he realized numbly. The other clung tighter, small fingers tightening in the adult's hair. Not just a Bigfoot, a family. The adult's eyes opened. Caleb forgot how to breathe. They weren't glowing embers or alien orbs. They were dark brown, almost black, with a ring of amber catching the light. Intelligence lived there, and exhaustion, and something like wariness sharpened to a point. For a long, frozen moment, boy and creature stared at each other across a strip of worn wooden floor. No one moved. The younger one gave a soft, questioning chirr, pressing its face into the adult's side. The adult, she, he realized suddenly, somehow, shifted slightly, placing one broad arm more securely around the small bodies, protecting them even before worrying about herself. Caleb's thoughts raced and tripped over each other. This is my bed, my house. They broke in. They're dangerous. They are endangered. The valley hunts them. They have babies. They're in my space. They're tired. She didn't roar, didn't lunge. She watched him, breathing slow, as if trying to decide whether he was a threat or just another strange part of the human world that had pushed too far into hers. Slowly, very slowly, Caleb lifted both hands away from his body, showing empty palms. "This is my cabin," he said quietly, keeping his voice low, steady. "But I'm not here to hurt you." It felt ridiculous, talking to a creature that might not understand words, but tone mattered. Animals knew tone. So did people, even when they pretended otherwise. The mother's gaze flicked to his hands, then to the doorway behind him. One ear twitched. She inhaled deeply, scenting him. The outside, the faint trace of other humans he'd passed in the valley. Her lips pulled back a fraction, showing strong teeth, but the sound that followed wasn't a snarl. It was something rougher, sadder, a tired warning, the kind a cornered animal gave when it didn't really want to fight. Caleb's shoulders dropped fractionally. "You were here before me," he murmured, surprising himself. "The mountain was yours first." One of the little ones, larger than a dog but smaller than a man, fur softer looking, lighter in patches, peered around its mother's arm again. Its eyes were huge, curious, unafraid in a way that tightened his chest. It made a soft clucking noise and reached one hand toward him, fingers flexing. The mother rumbled sharply, pulling it back, a gesture as universal as any human parent's. Careful. He shouldn't have smiled at that, but he did. The movement seemed to confuse her more than anything else he'd done. She shifted, gathering her weight under her, as if preparing to rise if she had to. Caleb realized then that however strange this moment was for him, it was worse for her. She'd brought her children into the one place humans claimed as theirs out here, a cabin, and fallen asleep from exhaustion because she hadn't felt safe anywhere else. And now the human who owned it stood over her, deciding what happened next. He thought of the valley hunters, of the men who laughed as they traded stories about night scopes and baiting trails. Bigfoot were good for a bounty, if you could prove you'd caught one. A whole family. They'd tear the mountain apart to get at that. If he told anyone what he'd found here, these three wouldn't survive the week. The realization settled on him with a weight as heavy as fresh snow. "Okay," he said softly, more to himself than to them. "All right." He took a single step back, letting the curtain fall halfway between them like a truce line. The mother's gaze tracked him, unblinking. "You can stay," he said. It felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. "For now, just don't break anything else." One of the juveniles made a sound that could almost have been a laugh. He wasn't ready for that, not yet. Caleb backed into the main room, heart pounding, and closed the door gently behind him, as if a simple wooden panel would keep the world from crashing in. He leaned both hands on the table, breathing hard. His house was occupied by a mother Bigfoot and her two young. He had nowhere else to go. Neither did they. Somewhere under the shock and the rising panic, something thin and bright flickered, a spark of strange, reckless purpose. The mountain had given him a choice. For once in his life, other people's voices weren't telling him what to do. He straightened slowly. If they were going to survive this together, him and the family sleeping in his bed, he'd have to keep them hidden from the valley, from the hunters, from anyone who thought the world was simpler than it really was. And that, he knew, was going to change everything. The next morning, Caleb moved through the cabin with the uneasy awareness of someone sharing their home with a secret. Every shift of wood, every sigh of the stove, reminded him that behind the curtain lay 3 beings who weren't supposed to exist. The juveniles stirred softly, their quiet clicks rising like questions in the dim light. The mother kept them still, her presence a warm, silent weight in the far corner. Caleb felt her attention even when he couldn't see her. They were waiting, watching to see what he would do next. So he did the only thing he could. He cooked. He set beans to boil, added what little dried venison he had, and let the smell curl through the air. It drifted toward the alcove, carrying warmth and the promise of something safe. A soft sound answered from behind the curtain, curious and trembling. Caleb ladled a generous portion into a bowl and approached cautiously. "I'm just leaving this," he murmured, sliding it inside without crossing the invisible line between trust and threat. A large, furred arm eased out to take the bowl, not snatching, but deliberate, controlled. The mother distributed the food to her young with gentle precision. They fell into a quiet rhythm over the next days. Caleb hunted, trapped, and fished early, always returning before anyone from the valley could notice fresh prints in the snow. He found signs everywhere now, branches bent too high for deer, footprints crossing the creek where it ran shallow, faint scents in the air. The family had been surviving here long before they entered his cabin. The juveniles grew braver each day, watching him split wood through the window, mimicking his motions with sticks. The mother never came fully into the open, but her presence hovered like a protective shadow. One morning, he found the firewood stacked neatly, far more tidily than he'd left it. Snow had been swept from the roof, long marks showing the path of a massive arm. Caleb stood there, stunned, then laughed under his breath. They were helping him, paying rent in their own strange, careful way. Inside, the juveniles peered from the curtain, as if expecting his reaction. When he smiled, their ears perked, and one let out a soft chirp of delight. The mother's eyes remained steady, watchful, but something softer flickered there too. Acceptance didn't happen quickly with her kind, but it was happening. Everything shifted when he heard the distant crunch of hooves on snow. Voices followed, familiar, unwelcome. Caleb's stomach clenched. He moved to the window and saw 2 riders approaching the clearing. One was Ranger Aaliyah Garner. The other was Mark Killey, whose curiosity always drifted toward trouble. Behind him, the cabin fell silent. Caleb didn't have to look to know the mother had gathered her young behind the curtain. Their breathing quieted to faint tremors. He stepped outside, pulling the door tight behind him. Killey grinned in that sharp way of his, already searching the ground for signs he shouldn't see. "Afternoon," Aaliyah greeted him, reins in hand. "We heard strange noises up this ridge." Caleb kept his expression calm. "Rockslide," he lied. "Wind's been shifting the cliffs." Killey crouched near the woodpile, fingers brushing the snow. "These prints," he said casually, "don't look like rockslide." Caleb's pulse slammed once, hard. "Moose," he said evenly. "Came through 2 nights ago." Killey didn't believe him. That much was clear. But Elia intervened, reminding him to let the mountain be. They warned Caleb to stay aware, then rode off, leaving him in the settling quiet. Only when he stepped back inside did he exhale fully. The curtain lifted an inch. 2 young faces stared out, wide-eyed and trembling. Caleb moved slowly, hands open. "They're gone," he whispered. The older juvenile crept forward, curiosity fighting lingering fear. The mother emerged a moment later, shoulders tense, gaze flicking from the door to Caleb. She understood enough to know danger had brushed close. Caleb knelt, tapping the floor where Killy had inspected prints. "People are looking," he said softly. He gestured toward the window, then toward them. "Not safe here." The younger juvenile clung to her arm. The older stepped closer, watching him with unnervingly human intelligence. Caleb paced, mind racing. Then the memory came, his father pointing to a hidden valley high above the last ridge, a place he'd called the Quiet Pocket. No trails, no hunters, no reason for anyone to ever go there. A pocket of old forest where even the wind seemed to hesitate. He turned to the mother. "There's a place," he said, touching the map on the wall. He traced the route with slow, deliberate motions. She didn't understand the map, but she understood the direction in his voice. Away, hidden, safe. Her eyes held his. A silent question, a plea, a yes. Decision settled over him like snow on pine boughs, quiet, heavy, irreversible. He began packing at dawn, filling his father's old canvas sack with food and tools. The older juvenile watched every motion, occasionally adding small offerings, a stone, a twig, a bit of broken pottery, as if helping. The mother observed from the shadows, her presence steady and solemn. When Caleb slung the pack onto his shoulders, she stepped to the door with her children, waiting. It was strange how natural it felt, opening the door for them, not as intruders, but as travelers who belonged here as much as he did. The climb was difficult, even for Caleb, but the Bigfoot family moved with quiet strength. The juveniles ranged ahead, doubling back whenever their mother rumbled a warning. Several times, the older one walked beside Caleb, matching his steps like a curious shadow. Once, when Caleb slid on ice, a huge hand caught his arm, steadying him before he could fall. He murmured thanks without thinking, and the juvenile mimicked the sound perfectly. It startled a laugh out of him, one that echoed strangely between the trees. The mother glanced back with an expression he couldn't read, half caution, half something gentler. As sunset approached, clouds built behind the far peaks, heavy with an approaching storm. Eliah's warning echoed in Caleb's mind. They pushed harder, climbing the last steep rise to the lip of the Quiet Pocket. When they reached it, the world opened. A hidden valley lay below, ringed by cliffs, ancient trees rising like pillars from untouched snow. The mother stepped forward, breath catching in a low, reverent sound. Her children echoed her, voices overlapping in eerie harmony. Caleb felt the hairs on his arms rise. This place wasn't just shelter. It was sanctuary. They descended into the valley just as the first winds of the storm swept over the ridge. Caleb led them to a rock overhang he remembered from childhood, a natural shelter deep enough for warmth, sheltered enough to survive the winter's wrath. The juveniles explored it eagerly, tapping the walls, sniffing at old moss. The mother examined every corner before finally settling her young near him. Caleb showed her where water seeped clean from stone, where game trails cut through the snow, where they could move unseen. She listened intently, memorizing every detail as if her family's survival hung on it. Then, in a gesture he could never have expected, she reached out and pressed her hand to his chest, right over his heart. Caleb froze. The touch wasn't forceful, it wasn't warning. It was acknowledgement, gratitude deeper than words. The juveniles watched silently, their wide eyes soft with understanding. When she withdrew her hand, the space it left behind felt strangely warm. He'd done more than guide them here. He'd become part of something older than any valley tale. Outside, the storm roared to life, snow whipping sideways. Inside their small haven, the fire glowed softly, protecting them from the world above. They spent the night tucked beneath stone and shadow, the storm howling like a living thing beyond their reach. The juveniles curled against their mother, who kept her gaze turned toward the entrance as if guarding them all, including him. Caleb sat with his back to the wall, feeling the warmth of shared breath, the steady presence of beings who should have been myths. He sipped hot water from his dented tin cup, watching sparks drift from the fire. He felt something he hadn't felt in years: safety, not earned through solitude, but through connection he couldn't have imagined days ago. When morning finally broke, the storm had buried the world in white. They waited until the wind softened before moving. Caleb rose, shouldering his pack again. He touched the mother's arm lightly. A question, a promise. She answered with a low rumble, gentle and firm. The juveniles mimicked it, their voices overlapping. He didn't need translation. They would be all right now. They had a home, a refuge, a future. Caleb stepped into the snow, breath steaming in the crisp morning air. The mother watched him go, her silhouette framed by the overhang's shadow. The juveniles peered out beside her. He walked back toward the lower ridges alone, the path already half hidden by snow. The distance felt heavier than it had before, but not lonely. The mountain had changed him, or maybe he'd simply uncovered the part of himself that had always belonged to it. He knew what he'd say if anyone in town asked about strange prints or odd echoes from the cliffs. He'd shrug and say what his father used to. Mountains keep their own secrets. And at night, when he looked toward the highest ridge, he'd know a family was watching back, safe because of him. In the days that followed, whispers would stir through the valley, lost hunters returning unharmed, cattle spared from winter predators, strange harmonies deep in the forest that no one could identify. People would call it luck, balance, a quiet year. Caleb would simply smile and keep chopping wood. Only he knew the truth. Once, he had opened his door to the wild, and the wild had not only stepped inside, it had chosen him.